So there's two different types of like AOLs. There's two main different types of like AOL phenomenon that happen. In CRV, the one is called AOL, and then they have another column called AOL/S, AOL of the signal. So one of those AOLs is pretty easy to reduce, and with practice you can pretty much you'll eliminate it to a certain degree. You can greatly reduce that first kind of AOL. The AOL over the signal kind, those types of phenomenon will probably always be occurring to some degree or another within remote viewing, but with better understanding of the mechanisms behind it, you can learn to use it to your advantage. It doesn't have to be this kind of like thing that you avoid and kind of dance around, because that can like ruin the flow of information. This here is the threshold of awareness. Okay, we got conscious things that you're aware of and things that are below your threshold of awareness here. Okay, so we can imagine the remote viewing signal comes up, touches the threshold of awareness like this, something like this. Okay, this is a very simplex representation here. Okay, these are simplex visualizations to help gain a better understanding of how these things might work. Okay, so we got the remote viewing signal. If you didn't see my last video on brainwaves, you can check that out. I'll put a link here for that. But the idea here is that whenever you're remote viewing, whenever you probe, you're penetrating the deeper meaning of things, you're gaining the insight, you're entering into. Okay, so you can imagine it looking something like this. Okay, you can imagine this line as the brain waves. Okay, so as you get more focused, you drop down closer to the threshold of awareness. Alright, this is what happens. You get in focus, you're probing. Something happens here. These two signals have an interference with each other. Okay, so where these signals interfere, that's where you're having a perception of something. Alright, but it's not as straightforward as you just directly perceive the signal like that. Okay, so there's a bunch of processes that happen in the time between where the signal actually enters your information system and that it gets into your conscious awareness for you to actually give your response. Okay, so AOL has to do with the stuff that happens right here in your internal processing. Okay, so AOL has to do with this. So this has to do with the difference between impulses and responses. Okay, so AOL happens usually happens in this area right here. Okay, I've talked about this in an earlier video, but basically these are like what we call like real impressions. Okay, so like real data signal. Everything else would be considered like noise. So things that aren't the signal. So this is usually where AOL happens, in these areas in between actual target contact. So this is where you'll usually be guessing, trying to formulate a story about the data that you collected here and here. So let's say you collected information here and here. Now that you probed, you listed you listed the data. Now you got this time here in between. Your conscious mind has a function where it wants to like come to a conclusion. So that's its job. One of the intelligences in the conscious mind is to come to this conclusion. Something happened here and something happened there. So it's trying to like formulate a story. What happened first? Why did this happen? Cause and effect. It's trying to figure that out. And then it's going to make up a story. It's going to bring these things together, which is like what we were talking about with thinking, right? Comparing and discerning and trying to come to a conclusion. So that's the most common type of AOL, right? Conscious thinking of data that you already produced. Like you listed something, and then now you're kind of like thinking about the stuff you already listed, okay? And you're coming up with ideas. That's like the most common type of AOL. That type of AOL, with time, you'll just get better with training by using the AOL column, writing it in the AOL column. You'll start to recognize, that behavior. You'll be like, okay, I always jump to conclusions, and you'll eventually correct yourself. But the type of AOLs, these are the type of AOLs that can be reduced pretty easily with practice. The other type of AOL, which in CRV is usually called like AOL over the signal. There's like two AOL columns. So like AOL/S, AOL over the signal. That's something else. This is something that's more. This is more of like the kind of idea that this might be like unavoidable. Like stuff like this might always happen. The main difference why these AOL over the signal types may always happen has to do with the difference between like impulses and responses. Okay, so a response is a reaction to like a stimulus. So whenever the remote viewing signal, we got the threshold of awareness, awareness and non-aware. Whenever the signal, let's say this is a remote viewing signal. Whenever you have a perception, so let's say right here, you have a perception. The remote viewing signal meets your brainwave signal or crosses the threshold of awareness. Okay. This causes an influence of some sort. So our traditional idea of cause and effect is a little flawed. So we like to think of things as cause and then the effect, right? We like to think in terms of cause and effect, like a two-step process. One causes the other. But in reality, it's more something like cause, and then there's some kind of influence, and then we see the effects. This is more of, it's more of like a three-step process, and that's where this AOL stuff comes in. So the target signal and the brainwave sync up. You have a perception here where the signals interfere. This causes an influence. They're influencing each other. So your brainwaves, your awareness is coming in contact with this target signal. So you're kind of like bringing some of your awareness into this, right? Like probe, like we were saying. Probe is to like enter into. So you're like entering into this information field. All right? So it's having an influence on you. You're having an influence on it. And then that's going to cause some kind of effect. Okay? So it's not as straightforward as that the signal just comes into your consciousness and then you just perceive it. The signal has some kind of influence, and then the influence causes some kind of effect. Whenever you probing the signal gives you an impulse. Now this is something that you're going to have to observe through practice and doing this over and over again. When you probe, you're going to get an impulse. So this is the result of this influence of the target signal and your awareness. So it's like you probe, this gives an impulse. Well, the probing causes an influence. There's some influence that happens. Influence happens. From the influence causes an impulse. Now, what's an impulse? An impulse is not a response. Okay, so a lot of people think of it as like you probe and then what you get is a response. But it's not exactly like that. You probe, some kind of influence happens, and and this gives an impulse in the body. So the impulse is a wave of excitation that happens in the body. Okay, so impulse comes from the root word impel, and impel has to do with causes. So an impulse is not a response. An impulse is more like a cause. An impulse is a wave of excitation transmitted through tissues, and especially nerve fibers and muscles, that results in physiological activity or inhibition, like a nerve impulse, a sudden spontaneous inclination or incitement to some usually unpremeditated action, a propensity or natural tendency, usually other than rational. So that's what this impulse is. So this is experienced as this kind of like these vibrations that happen in your mind and body when you probe. So when you next time you do a remote viewing session, you pay attention to what happens in your body. When you probe, there's a vibration, there's an impulse that comes into the body. The impulse is like an energetic phenomenon, okay? It has to be like interpreted by the processing intelligences within your mind and in your body. So the impulse is not perceived like directly. The impulse has to be like kind of like translated. There's got to be like certain pieces of information within your awareness or within your reality box, within your vocabulary, so to speak, that can like match up to this impulse. So there's kind of like a little translation process that has to happen here. And this translation process, that's where you get your reaction or your response. Okay? That's where you get your reaction and your response from. So the first type of AOL, the one that can be reduced, that one comes like down here. That's like whenever you got an impulse, you got the reaction or response to it, and now you're like thinking about your reaction or your response. That's the first kind of AOL. So you probe, influence happens, you get an impulse. The impulse is like gives you some kind of like, you have some kind of like perception or reaction to it. Like it may be vague, you get a word, you get whatever it is, smell, taste, temperature, some kind of perception happens, your reaction or your response, the result or the effect happens, and then the first kind of AOL is just thinking, analyzing these different reactions and responses. So let's say you had a bunch of these, or one came through strongly. That's you thinking about this and trying to make a name about it, saying it's this or that. That's the first kind of AOL that can be reduced. The second kind of AOL, the AOL over the signal type that may not be able to be reduced, that happens here. The impulse, this translation process, this may create, you may only have a certain vocabulary, a certain concept in your mental arsenal to represent what this impulse is, right? So you may have to use the wrong concept or wrong term. It may not be the right term or concept, but it's all you have to work with. It's the only word or the only part of your mental vocabulary that you have to represent what you can suss out of this impulse. So you should use it. It's not like, oh, that's an AOL, let me avoid it. No, you should be using it. But not only that, it's your best tool to communicate that idea. So you got to stop worrying about being like naming the target or saying what it is exactly to what like your intellectual expectation is. You need to focus more on describing the actual essence behind what the target is, and your AOL can do that, and it can be as good as an explanation as naming it. So don't be afraid of AOLs, and start to realize the difference between an impulse and like your response or reaction, right? The impulse and the response or reaction to the impulse, and your thinking or analysis of your response or reaction to the impulse. So it's kind of like these three stages that happen. So as you get better, you'll stop doing this third one. You'll be able to stop thinking about what happens in the session. But this one might still happen, but that's okay. You know what I mean? That's all right. I hope that kind of like explains the difference between like thinking AOL, analysis AOL, and like AOL over the signal. The translation of this impulse into like your actual response or perception of it. So there's like two different kinds of like AOLs that happen. Here's a clip of these experiments being done on this man who has his corpus callosum has been severed, so his left and right hemisphere don't communicate the same way as in most adults. So in this experiment, he's being flashed different words to different sides of the brain, and depending on the types of intelligence that interpret these signals, he acts out in different ways. His conscious mind takes that information that was kind of like subliminally inserted, and he acts out on it, and his conscious mind doesn't even know the reason why. It just makes up a story as to why it did it, just like a viewer does when they commit AOL. So AOL is more about these different intelligences within us that are communicating with each other and into our conscious awareness, and it can usually be attributed to like an overworking of one, right? Because you're working with limited information. So in this case, in this video, this man has a severed corpus callosum, so he's not getting the full picture at once. In remote viewing, you're not getting the full picture because the target's hidden. You're not getting the full picture at all.
Hey Joe, I want you to keep your hands out in front of you.
In an experiment that's now a classic in brain research, Mike Gazzaniga over 30 years ago used a similar setup to find out if the two halves of the brain are specialized to do different things.
Ship.
Joe is being flashed a word only to one half of his brain. Words flashed to the right
Storm.
are seen only by his left brain, and Joe can report seeing those words just fine.
Piano. Good.
But when a word is flashed to his right brain,
Didn't see that. Okay. Joe, I'm going to ask you
but now watch what happens.
to draw that with your left hand.
You get me lost.
Why don't you try drawing another picture of it over here if that will help you.
Oh, phone.
Oh, okay.
Durr.
It's almost as though somebody has given him a secret communication.
That's
and
right.
Now he knows that it's a telephone. But up until then, he was blind to it.
You point to the word.
Again, Joe sees two words simultaneously. Bell goes to his non-speaking right brain. Music to his speaking left brain. When asked to point to a picture of what he saw, he chooses Bell. But when asked why,
Yeah, why'd you pick that one?
Music.
Music?
and when asked to
A lot of
explain,
music up there.
It was music and bell, and it was a few minutes ago. Last time I heard any music was coming from the bells out here,
Uh-huh.
banging away.
So the bell's
Yeah.
outside here.
So, look, good enough answer to me.
what's extraordinary is that Joe's speaking left brain concocts a plausible story of why he pointed to Bell, even when some of the other pictures more obviously represent music. Gazzaniga believes this determination to find cause and effect, this desire to explain, is the left hemisphere's most marvelous property.
One of the unique things to the human brain is this need to interpret why two events occurred. What was the antecedent to this? What caused this?
So most of us think of intelligence as like this like single like aspect of the mind. Like if you could visualize your consciousness, most people would think of it as like, I don't know, like, intelligence being like this huge part of it, and it's just like, intelligence. But in reality, it's more like we have different intelligences. So like an IQ test, it's not necessarily testing intelligence per se. It's testing like one kind of intelligence that we have, and that's like the memorization, like simple level problem solving, like response to like a pre-memorized question type stuff. You know what I mean? Doing some like math problems. That's like the kind of intelligence that they're testing with the IQ test. But there's all these other kinds of intelligences that you could imagine are in here, and they're all linked together. They're all talking to each other, and if you put too much of a load on one intelligence, it's gonna like make the whole system like kind of like muck up, or put stress on another part of the system. So you can imagine like AOL is like AOL can like occur. You can think of AOL happening when like one part of the system is too stressed. So you can think of it as like these overlapping intelligences, and then your awareness is like this little thing in the middle. And depending on your ability to expand your awareness, you become aware of these different things and these different intelligences. But they're all speaking to each other. They're all trading information, and then it's kind of like compressed. A bunch of it's like cut off, and then only a certain amount will actually enter into like your conscious awareness, right? So AOL can occur usually when you're like taxing one intelligence too much. You know what I mean? Like you're asking too much from one kind of intelligence, and it doesn't have those kind of answers for you. You need to like query some of the other types of intelligences within the body or within the consciousness. But it's hard to like query something that you don't know exists, like you don't know you have. So that's the main problem with like human consciousness. You gotta like kind of like become aware of something to actually like orient it and use it or give power to it. So if you're only going for sights, if you're only going for smells, taste, temperatures, that's like asking like just the sensory intelligences for information. It's like you're not gonna find out certain other things. So you need to like probe, enter into the different intelligence systems in order to get certain kinds of information as well. So you're probably saying like, what do you mean? What do you mean different intelligence systems? Like I can see, I can hear, everything's working. Well, these are like faculties of the mind.